Good morning, colleagues. The 9,796th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for the meeting is maintenance of peace and security in Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Estonia, Poland and Ukraine to participate in the meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Miroslav Jancha, Assistant Secretary-General for Europe, Central Asia and Americas, Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I give the floor to Mr. Miroslav Jancha.
Madam President, only last week, Under-Secretary General Di Carlo, on behalf of the Secretary General, recounted the horrific toll of the 1,000 days of Russia's full-scale invasion have brought to the people of Ukraine. The invasion that was launched in gross violation of the UN Charter and international law. Yet, in recent days, we have seen alarming signs of further escalation in this already explosive war. The latest developments follow the disturbing reports of troops from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea being deployed to the conflict zone. On 21st November, the Ukrainian city of Dnipro was hit by a ballistic intermediate-range Russian missile. The location hit was reportedly an industrial area southwest of Dnipro city. According to the Ukrainian authorities, the missile was equipped with 6 warheads, each with 6 submunitions, and took only 15 minutes to arrive from the launch site in the Astrakhan region of the Russian Federation, some 1,000 kilometers away from Dnipro city. Hours after the strike, the President of the Russian Federation confirmed that Russia had tested a new conventional intermediate-range missile called Oreshnik. He said that the strike was launched in response to the use of Western-supplied long-range missiles by the armed forces of Ukraine against the territory of the Russian Federation. He further stated that Russia would continue testing the new missile in combat. Yesterday, Russian authorities signaled the likelihood of further such strikes following additional reported Ukrainian strikes on Russian military targets using the above-mentioned long-range missiles. The United Nations does not have additional details on these incidents, including on the type of weapons used. However, the use of ballistic missiles and related threats are a very dangerous escalatory development. Under international humanitarian law, parties are required to, and I quote, take all feasible precautions in the choice of means and methods of attack with a view to avoiding and, in any event, to minimizing incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects." End of quote. We condemn all attacks on civilian targets and critical infrastructure, irrespective of the weapon system used. We urge all parties to take immediate steps to de-escalate and to refrain from any action or rhetoric that could further intensify this war, bring more suffering to the civilian population, and gravely endanger regional and international peace and security. Madam President, amidst these concerning reports, systematic Russian aerial strikes have continued to wreak havoc across Ukraine. Just yesterday, Russia reportedly launched 188 drones against 17 regions of Ukraine. This was reportedly the record number of drones deployed in a single attack. Since February 2022, at least 12,162 civilians have been killed and 26,919 injured in Ukraine, according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. In addition to civilian casualties, relentless attacks hitting residential areas continue to cause severe damage to civilian infrastructure, further deteriorating the living conditions for millions of Ukrainians. Madam President, the cost of this war is already too high for the people of Ukraine and for the world, and it is growing by the day. We must reverse the dangerous cycle of escalation. This requires genuine political will and inclusive diplomatic efforts towards a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. We stand ready to use our good offices and to make available all our tools and experience to this end. Thank you.
Thank Mr. Jencer for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Assistant Secretary General Jencer, for your briefing. When Russia launched its unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin expected a quick and decisive victory. But the Kremlin underestimated the people of Ukraine and their determination, strength, and courage. Despite all the suffering and substantial risk to global peace and security, at the cost of tens of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian lives, and against the protests of the international community and the council of this council, Putin has escalated and expanded his war of choice. Just days ago, Russia launched an experimental ballistic missile at Ukraine. The weapon was a new intermediate-range ballistic missile, which was based on Russia's RS-26 Rubyaj intercontinental ballistic missile. Ukraine withstood the strike, as it has withstood countless attacks from Russia. Russia began escalating and expanding the war some time ago, when it turned to other countries to supply its dwindling stocks of ammunition, missiles, and drones, violating this Council's resolutions by importing North Korean and Iranian missiles. Suffering more than 1,000 Russian casualties per day, Russia introduced over 10,000 DPRK troops to the battlefield. In the past year, at Russia's request, the DPRK has also unlawfully transferred over 18,000 containers of munitions and munitions-related materiel, and more than 100 ballistic missiles for use against Ukraine, all of which have been used to strike populated areas like Kyiv and Zaporizhzhia. The DPRK is preparing to transfer even more ballistic missiles. We also have information a large number of DPRK origin 170mm long-range self-propelled artillery pieces and 240mm long-range multiple rocket launchers are being introduced into the conflict. None of this is without cost. We have information Russia transferred air defense systems to North Korea. Pyongyang is receiving other substantial benefits like free and subsidized fuel, relieving pressure that constricted the DPRK for decades. Russia is also selling the DPRK dual-use technology and equipment so the Kim regime can improve DPRK military manufacturing and capabilities. On this, we note that China has influence and capacity when it comes to the DPRK, and it is urgent it use this influence to prevent a further escalation of the conflict. With respect to Russia, time and again, the Kremlin has chosen to ignore its responsibilities as a permanent member of the Security Council, reneging on its commitments, indifferent to how its actions have undermined international peace and security. In March, Russia vetoed the 1718 Sanctions Committee panel of experts to conceal its violations of the Council's arms embargo. The veto was also a gift to Pyongyang, which has long sought to evade sanctions against it. The Kremlin has continuously shown disdain for the resolutions of this Council. Russia's training of DPRK soldiers involving arms or related materiel, as well as its procurement of ballistic missiles from DPRK, violate Security Council Resolutions 1718, 1874, and 2270, which all member states are required to faithfully implement. As Russia expands and escalates the conflict, the Kremlin blames others for perpetuating the war and spreads false narratives. The Kremlin equates its drone and missile strikes with those of Ukraine, ignoring a fundamental difference. Ukraine has every right to defend itself against invasion under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Russia has no right to assault the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other UN member states. Equating Ukraine's struggle for survival with Russia's expansionism undermines everything this Council and the Charter are designed to protect. Make no mistake, Russia continues to barrage the UN Security Council with disinformation in the hopes that the truth gets lost and the world tunes out. We cannot fall victim to Russia's cynical tactics and must remain focused on its violations of international law. We must stand by Ukraine, a fellow UN member state, as it defends itself from Russia's aggression. So, to help Ukraine protect itself from Russia's escalating and expanding war, the United States is providing Ukraine with hundreds of additional Patriot and AMRAAM missiles to strengthen its air defenses. The United States will continue to surge security assistance to Ukraine to strengthen its capabilities, including air defense, and put Ukraine in the best possible position on the battlefield. The United States stands with a community of nations in support of Ukraine and the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Our future is at stake. Russia's war threatens our NATO allies, European security, and the fundamental rights enshrined in the UN Charter. We renew the call for Russia to end this war and immediately withdraw its forces from Ukrainian territory within its internationally recognized borders, and to meet its responsibilities as a member of this Council. The United States will continue to make this a priority, particularly DPRK's involvement in the war during our December presidency. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'd like to begin by thanking ASG Janša for his briefing. Madam President, we find ourselves at a peculiar moment in time when the integrity of European and global security hangs by a thread. The war on Ukraine has been dangerously escalating in the past couple of months. Some of the latest chapters feel like they come from a work of fiction. Unfortunately, they do not. I'm referring particularly to the reports of the DPRK's troops deployment to Europe. Such a development is unprecedented and is impacting regional security in multiple parts of the globe. At the same time, this deployment infringes upon multiple Security Council resolutions and needs to be addressed further. What is more, heating up irresponsible nuclear rhetoric, including the field testing of a nuclear-capable ballistic missile, is a cause for concern. It is a chilling reminder of something that, for many decades, the international community worked very hard to avoid. Madam President, this war is spreading, intensifying, and taking ever more lives. Just 2 nights ago, Russia launched a record 188 drones onto Ukraine. 10 days ago, it launched the largest combined airstrike in months. The aerial attacks are becoming larger, with more firepower, with modernized weapons. All of this is destroying critical civilian infrastructure and the natural environment in swathes. It comes on top of threats to the physical integrity of civilian nuclear facilities, which is of great concern to my country. Madam President, colleagues, these developments are evidently dangerous. With each passing day, the risk of escalation and spillover increases. We need peace in Ukraine, a peace which is acceptable to Ukraine, a peace that respects international law, and a peace that is based on the UN Charter. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank ASG Janša for his briefing. President, tomorrow will be Thanksgiving here in the U.S. Right before this holiday, we're gathered here today to consider again the Ukraine issue, while witnessing once again the expansion of the fighting, the spread of war flames, and the cruelty of war. I can't help but wonder, at this moment, can those caught in the war be reunited with their families? Is there anyone they can be thankful for? Can they have a happy and peaceful tomorrow? Sadly, the Ukraine crisis has been dragging on, and the recent fighting on the ground has become ever more intense. The number of weapons on the battlefield is still increasing, and the variety is expanding. Long-range weapons and cluster munitions have been used, causing serious damages to the infrastructure and heavy casualties. Recently, there have even been reports that anti-personnel landmines will be used in combat. We are deeply concerned and worried about the intensified fighting. We once again call on both parties to the conflict to remain calm and exercise restraint, give up their obsession with winning by force, abandon the myth of a complete military victory, prioritize peace and the people's interest, and start peace talks at an early date and realize a ceasefire. Meanwhile, the Ukraine crisis has now reached a critical moment. Recently, the international community has seen increasingly stronger calls for peace, and discussions on ending the war have increased significantly. Some ideas and proposals, as well as the reactions by the parties, have been reported in the media. We call on the international community to make greater efforts to consolidate consensus, jointly scale up peace efforts, and create synergy in promoting peace talks. China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent, which is to promote peace talks and a political settlement. Since the outbreak of the crisis, China stated that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries must be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter must be observed. The reasonable security concerns of all countries must be taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis must be supported. We have maintained engagement and exchanges with Russia, Ukraine, and all other relevant parties, actively conducted shadow diplomacy through our special representative, and remained committed to promoting peace talks. We, together with Brazil, Algeria, and other members of the Global South, established the Group of Friends for Peace on the Ukraine crisis and call for upholding the three principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no fueling the flame by any party, while bringing together the voices advocating for peace of the Global South, thus contributing our collective wisdom and strength to the early de-escalation of the situation and a political settlement. In this context, China is ready to work with all parties concerned, including the Global South, to continue to make unremitting efforts to promote the arrival of the dawn of peace and the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis at an early date. President, the U.S. representative has mentioned China in his statement. I would like to respond briefly. Promoting an early political settlement of the Ukraine crisis requires the joint efforts of the international community. Since the outbreak of the crisis, China has always been making every effort for peace and peace talks. We call on all parties, especially the U.S., to work with China to make genuine efforts to end the war. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, President. We commend the United Kingdom for the swiftness with which they responded to the request from Ukraine to discuss recent escalations in the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. We welcome the Council's determination to keep this matter at the top of its agenda and hope that our deliberations today will encourage more deliberate steps toward de-escalation and to resolving the conflict peacefully. I thank ASG Yancha for the important updates provided. Madam President, Guyana finds the reports of escalations in the conflict deeply troubling. We are among the majority of UN member states that continue to call for an immediate end to the unrelenting violence and violations of international law seen in this conflict. It is innocent civilians who continue to bear the brunt of this conflict. Just yesterday, at your initiative, Madam President, the Council met to discuss the protection of civilians in armed conflict and the need for more concrete efforts to protect humanitarian workers. We heard from every member of the UN Security Council about the need to prevent and respond to such attacks. We believe it is self-evident that the first step in this regard is to work together to end the hostilities, not only in Ukraine, but in other parts of the world as well. In this respect, Guyana wishes to reiterate its call for a peaceful resolution to the ongoing conflict. As we consider the options that would take us to such an end state, we demand that the parties comply with their obligations under international law and prioritize the protection of civilians and civilian objects, taking all necessary precautions to protect them from harm. Every life matters. UNICEF has reported that an average of at least 16 children are killed or injured in Ukraine every week. The total number of civilian casualties currently stands at over 30,000, which includes civilians killed or injured since February 2022, the vast majority from bombings in urban areas. Thousands more continue to endure relentless hostilities, prolonged displacement, and severe shortages of essential resources, including safe water, electricity, and other necessities. The situation gets worse each time there is an escalation in the conflict. It is for this reason that Guyana continues to call for a serious political and diplomatic process to pave the path to peace. We commend the efforts of those who have committed to finding pathways to peacefully end the war and stress the need for this to be a collective endeavor. We insist on this Council living up to the responsibility entrusted to it and take action to protect civilians and change a dangerous trajectory that this conflict is taking. We also remain firm in our view that respect for the provisions of the UN Charter and international law must be upheld, and therefore call on the Russian Federation to withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. In closing, Guyana stands ready to contribute to any effort that will lead to a lasting and sustainable peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I also thank ASG Yencha for their sobering briefing. Today we convene to deliberate on yet another serious escalation. Just yesterday, the Russian Federation launched over 100 drones and missiles aimed at more than 10 Ukrainian regions, including the cities of Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia. While it seems that most of these attacks were intercepted, they still led to a considerable number of injuries and physical damage. Such actions are coupled with the worrying deployment of a new ballistic missile, which was launched at Ukraine last week, further causing significant damage. This is yet another escalatory tactic with the potential of unleashing more havoc on the people of Ukraine. It is deeply troubling that Ukraine might potentially be used for the testing of new weapons by the Russian Federation. Neither can we forget about the systematic targeting of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, in particular energy infrastructure. This month alone, the Russian Federation launched another massive missile and drone attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, with the sole intent of damaging Ukraine's energy capacity just before the upcoming winter months. Malta condemns all attacks on civilian targets and critical infrastructure. This Council must reiterate in no uncertain terms its call on all parties to fully uphold international humanitarian law and the principles of distinction and proportionality. Malta also continues to call for full and unfettered safe access for all humanitarian workers currently operating on the ground in Ukraine. President, Malta again reiterates its deep concern with regards to the transfer of weapons and ammunition from DPRK and Iran to the Russian Federation, as well as the deployment of troops from DPRK on the front lines in Ukraine. The presence of foreign troops on the front lines in Ukraine broadens the scope of this war and increases the scope for escalation and directly endangers European and global peace and security. We call on all states to stop supporting and enabling Russia's illegal war of aggression. We stress the need for full accountability for all crimes committed by Russia and Ukraine, and reaffirm our support to the ongoing work of the ICC, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and the Register of Damage. We also further reiterate our support for the establishment of a special tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Together, we need to focus on achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter. We will support all efforts aimed at achieving such goals. Malta can never accept a world in which might is right. In closing, President, let me reiterate that Ukraine has a right to defend itself under Article 51 of the UN Charter. We once again call on the Russian Federation to immediately end the war it started and to withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, I thank you first for giving me the floor. We thank the Assistant Secretary General for his briefing. We acknowledge the presence in this chamber of the permanent representative of Ukraine. Madam President, the Security Council has considered extensively on this issue, including during your recent signature event. Yet, despite this attention, we remain missing in action. What is urgently needed now is bold action, rooted constructive approaches that foster confidence building, anchor a ceasefire, and pave the way for durable settlement. Regrettably, as the communication promptly this meeting illustrates, the trajectory remains one of the escalation, inflammatory rhetoric, and misguided strategy of scale it to descale it. Such a calculation is dangerous, with consequences that will extend far beyond the battlefield. Madam President, we reiterate our call to the warring parties to adhere to international humanitarian law, which categorically prohibits attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. These are binding norms, not optional principles. With winter setting in, targeting of energy grids and essential services in Ukraine poses egress threat, risking millions of lives through exposure, hunger, and deprivation. Madam President, the clear and present risk of nuclear escalation further underscore the urgency of action. The fallout of such catastrophic event, literal and figurative, would transcend borders, making survival itself a futile endeavor. As the Secretary General has repeatedly warned, there is no military solution to this war. Diplomacy must prevail. In this precarious moment, the old wisdom becomes self-evident. You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist. A return to the negotiation table is not just advisable, it is an imperative. We therefore call on all parties to halt escalation, reject the logic of mutual destruction, and commit to the measures that build trust, reduce hostilities, and protect civilians. History will judge us not by strength of our weapons, but our courage to choose peace over war. Let us act before it is too late. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель. Thank you, Madam President. The Kiev regime calling for this meeting, supported by its Western backers, proves that the Ukrainian president, whose term has expired, not only has not yet stopped tilting at North Korean windmills, so to speak, but has been giving the efforts particular importance in its strategy to provoke NATO countries to up the ante in the conflict with Russia. We think commenting on the new absurd accusations based as before on conjecture and phobias are to be pointless. Everything has been said at the previous meeting on this ridiculous subject on the 30th of October. Therefore, we'd like to focus today on the real aims of the Kiev authorities' propaganda and smear campaign. We've talked about this repeatedly, and all of our forecasts have come true. The bankrupt Zelensky regime needs at any cost to drag NATO countries into a direct conflict with Russia on the battlefield. With any other scenario, it would be facing a irreversible and humiliating defeat that, as demonstrated in the failed Kursk escapade of the Ukrainian head honcho and the clear collapse of the front in Donbass that has been pointed out by all military experts. Even Western news agencies have recognized that just last week alone, Russian troops liberated 235 square kilometers of territory. That is a record for 2024. The most powerful regions are collapsing that were set up by Kiev in 2014. In the ranks of the Ukrainian military, there's clear panic. The forced mobilized soldiers are fleeing en masse from their positions, and lying to his people is something that the actor Zelensky, who has usurped authority in violation of his constitution, is finding increasingly difficult. The citizens of Ukraine are fleeing his rule abroad if they're able to do so, or they're holing up at home so they can't be caught by military patrols who are throwing them into bloody battles, irrespective of their age or health. There's another catastrophic trend for the Kiev authorities, the mass return to former Ukrainian territories that are now under the control of Russia, of those people who lived there up until 2022, but decided now, or at the time succumbing to propaganda, to evacuate to the west. Just a few days ago, the Ukrainian authorities said that such returnees are now 150,000 people, and 50,000 of them have come back to Mariupol, which has been rebuilt. Basically, the population of that city has now returned, and this is very indicative. This is shocking information for Zelensky and his clique. But something that's even more shocking is the reasons why people are moving to Russia. This, inter alia, includes the poor treatment from Ukrainian-speaking compatriots, discrimination based on language and faith, the authorities not keeping their promises for socio and economic support, and widespread corruption and a lack of desire to engage in this inhumane regime. In other words, the Ukrainians are rejecting all the glamour of democracy that the sponsors of the Kiev regime are proclaiming so much in their statements. What kind of authority can tolerate this? And let's think about cooperation with the new American administration. The likelihood of who's coming to power is something which Zelensky tried very hard to ignore. He even violated diplomatic niceties. And even if we're to lay to one side the prediction that Donald Trump will cut assistance to Ukraine, which for the Ukrainian army would essentially be a death sentence, it's becoming clearer that he and his team will, in any case, conduct an audit of the assistance provided to Kiev. And this prospect for the main Kiev corrupt boss and its subordinates is the most frightening scenario, because over some 3 years now, they have plundered so much that the Western experts' hair is standing on its end. In the UK press last week, there was a publication about theft by Ukrainian civil servants directly linked to the office of the Ukrainian president, involved in so-called restoration of the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. The reports talk about a number of mega corrupt officials who are claiming that Russian strikes on these facilities means that war writes everything off. But this corruption and money laundering in the army is something that Ukrainian servicemen are always complaining about, and it's increasingly difficult for the authorities to be quiet about this. It's clear that many defense companies who on paper have received millions of dollars don't actually exist in actual fact. The former Labour Minister of Poland, Piotr Kulpa, in an interview admitted that about 30 to 50% of Western assistance to Ukraine has been plundered right from the beginning and consistently. From these resources, according to him, really equated to the annual budget of Ukraine. And quite clearly, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Can you imagine what scale of theft that we're talking about, sanctioned and backed from the very top? It is not surprising that the Ukrainian authorities are not taking any steps to conduct any audit whatsoever. And the only way of doing this is to provoke an escalation whereby all of these other things seem to be trifling in comparison. And the outgoing American administration is actively egging it on in doing this, and it's trying as much as it can to make a mess, both in Russia and with the new team in the White House. There's nothing surprising here. It takes two to tango, so to speak, in international corruption, and therefore the Biden team most likely really doesn't want to engage in financial checks. Therefore, that is the reason for all this fear-mongering regarding North Korean troops, just like it was previously with Iranian missiles. It's interesting what the West is going to come up with next. Maybe there's going to be Martians or little green aliens. It doesn't really matter. The main thing is to make an accusation. Distinguished colleagues, it's possible that these maneuvers of the Ukrainian corruptioneers and their Western conspirators might have gone unnoticed if, trying to destroy their tracks, they had not challenged peace throughout the whole world and had not, irrespective of what country you live in, placed the world on the brink of a global nuclear conflict. This is precisely what happened after the Biden administration and right after many of its European satellites authorized the Ukrainian army to use long-range missiles far inside Russia, and Zelensky has engaged in this. We saw this because we've had 2 rounds of such strikes. On the 19th of November, 6 ATACMS missile attacks that were made in the US were used, and on the 21st of November, there was a combined missile attack with a Storm Shadow made in the UK and the HIMARS in the US. They struck military targets in Bryansk and Kursk. They did not achieve their targets thanks to our anti-missile defense. However, as we've repeatedly underscored, the West, from that moment, provoked a regional conflict in Ukraine that has now taken on a global nature. In response to the use of American and UK long-range weapons on the 21st of November, the Russian armed forces conducted a combined strike on a military-industrial complex in Ukraine. For the first time, a new IRBM Russian missile system was used with non-nuclear hypersonic equipment. The effectiveness of such weaponry that has no analogy is something that that Western specialists assisting Ukraine can tell you about. However, the Zelensky regime did not take on board our warning and decided once again to test our resolve. Yesterday, on the 25th of November, the Russian Defense Ministry said that over the past 3 days, the Ukrainian army struck using Western missiles Kursk region and used 12 ATACMS missiles, and most of them exploded. However, there was not any major casualties. What else can we say? Well, let's just wait and see. Every wave of escalation from the West is going to be decisively responded to. I will be frank. We believe that it is our right to use our weapons against military facilities of those countries who allow the use of weapons against our facilities. So we're talking about the hypersonic weaponry today. There is the American anti-missile defense system in Europe. They cannot capture these. And we've warned you about this, but you've made your choice. We have said repeatedly that we are prepared to engage in negotiations. We have put forward specific proposals, and most recently in June this year. However, the Kiev head honcho and the West, time after time, have favored escalation. So is that your deliberate decision? Well, then it is completely shocking. Distinguished colleagues, in our opinion, this deliberate escalation from the US and its allies is something that we should be discussing today in the Security Council, because the global conflict that they are likely to provoke with today's weaponry is not going to spare anyone. The representative of the Kiev regime, of course, is not going to say anything about this, because all Ukrainian diplomacy wants to do right now is save the skin of Zelensky and its clique. And even if that means plunging the whole world into war, we would urge each and every one of you to think about this and not to make the mistake and to choose your priorities very carefully. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Madame la Présidente, je remercie le...
Madam President, I thank Assistant Secretary-General Miroslav Yanka for his briefing. We condemn the recent Russian attacks on various regions in Ukraine. We are alarmed by the numerous civilian casualties, including children, and the considerable damage inflicted on civilian infrastructure, particularly in Kharkiv, Odessa, and Zaporizhia. As winter approaches, nearly 150,000 families, as well as hospitals, schools and businesses, are without heating in the Dnipro and Ivano-Frankivsk regions. Switzerland, having condemned Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, launched over 1,000 days ago in flagrant violation of the UN Charter, is particularly concerned by the following issues. Firstly, we note a significant increase in the number of civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. We recall that attacks against civilians or civilian objects are prohibited. All parties must strictly respect international humanitarian law, in particular the rules governing the conduct of hostilities, and ensure the protection of the civilian population and respect for human rights. Secondly, we remain concerned that nuclear safety and security conditions remain precarious, particularly at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. All Ukrainian nuclear facilities are endangered by ongoing attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Switzerland supports the International Atomic Energy Agency in its vital work, as reiterated multiple times by its Director General, and particularly the 5 principles for the protection of the ZNPP. Finally, we are dismayed by the deleterious effect that Russian military aggression is having on the entire multilateral architecture of disarmament and arms control. We condemn Russia's repeated threats to use nuclear weapons and regret reports of even longer-range ballistic missile attacks against Ukraine. These developments illustrate the negative effects of developments over the last decade, particularly in the context of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and the suspension of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Increasingly substantiated reports suggest that troops from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea are not only deployed in Russia, but actively engaged in combat. This intensification of external support for Russian military aggression would also represent a serious violation of this Council's resolutions on non-proliferation Adding to this, the recent report from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons confirms the use of a riot control agent in Ukraine as a method of warfare in violation of the Convention on Chemical Weapons. Switzerland remains extremely concerned by Russia's repeated use of anti-personnel mines. It also expresses its deep concern at the recent announcement of the transfer of anti-personnel mines to Ukraine. This unprecedented development in the history of the Ottawa Convention risks having repercussions that go beyond this context. We call on all states to respect their obligations under international law, including those under the Ottawa Convention. Madam President, Switzerland calls on all states to respect their legal obligations and once again urges Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and withdraw its troops from the entirety of Ukrainian territory. As a member of the Security Council, Switzerland believes that this body has a responsibility and a duty to respond to the widely shared call for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. We reaffirm our commitment to supporting peace efforts based on international law and the UN Charter, in particular, the principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty. Switzerland continues to support the Secretary-General in the search for a peaceful solution and remains ready to contribute to all measures aimed at promoting peace in accordance with the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. And I thank the United Kingdom for convening this meeting and thank ASG Yencha for his informative briefing. Madam President, it has not been long since the Council members at the meeting on 18th November once again clearly condemned Russia's aggression. Japan, represented by State Minister Fujii, emphasized our commitment to the UN Charter and our solidarity with Ukraine. However, Russia ignored the repeated calls of the international community and once again carried out a large-scale missile attack on Ukraine, which caused the casualties of innocent civilians. We must not look away from this new worsening situation. Russia is continuously attacking Ukraine using weapons supplied by DPRK, violating the relevant Security Council resolutions. North Korea's troops have been deployed to Russia, and they are now engaged in combat against Ukraine. This constitutes a clear violation of international law, including the UN Charter. We condemn in the strongest terms this unlawful, unjustified, and unacceptable military cooperation between Russia and DPRK, which only further accelerates the tension in the region and beyond. We also reiterate our deep concern about military cooperation between Iran and Russia. Moreover, the Security Council should not overlook Russia's revision of its nuclear policy last week. Russia has repeatedly made remarks and taken actions indicating the use of nuclear weapons as its aggression. Japan, as the only country that has ever suffered atomic bombings during war, will never tolerate Russia's nuclear threats, let alone its use of nuclear weapons. Madam President, the members of the Security Council should not seek peace in a way that ignores Russia's sovereignty, nor should they demand equal de-escalation from both sides, which is only reward the aggressor. Nor should we confuse the defender with the aggressor. There must be a just and lasting peace consistent with the UN Charter. This goal has been repeatedly affirmed by an overwhelming majority of the UN General Assembly, leaving no room for doubt. We would like to repeat what is worth repeating. Ukraine is not waging a war of choice. Ukraine was forced to fight and is defending itself. It is Russia that launched an unprovoked war of aggression. Madam President, attempts to change the status quo by force would never succeed. Allowing such actions would have worldwide repercussions, affecting everyone in the future. The international community must act to stop the aggressor, not to seek a forced peace or to reward the aggressor. This is not a matter of choosing sides between Ukraine or Russia. It is a question of either upholding or disregarding the UN Charter. Japan once again strongly demands that Russia withdraw from Ukraine immediately and unconditionally. Japan continues to stand with Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Miroslav Janča for his briefing. Madam President, the recent developments that occurred in both Ukraine and Russia are deeply concerning. The use in this conflict of new types of destructive weapons, such as intermediate and long-range missiles, is a dangerous escalation. An escalation that could only worsen the yet tense situation that has already caused the death of so many innocent victims in Ukraine and Russia. We reiterate our call upon the parties to exert restraint and urgently reverse this escalatory rhetoric and to avoid the worst scenario. Algeria has warned many times, and it does again today, against the logic of confrontation and polarization that prevails in this conflict. Escalation could lead us to uncontrollable and unpredictable situations that no one wants to happen. It is high time to reverse the trend and favor diplomacy, dialogue, and negotiation. Only dialogue and negotiation can lead us to a ceasefire and stop the bloodshed. Only dialogue and negotiation can bring peace and security to Ukraine, to Russia, and to the whole region. It is critical that both parties choose the path of de-escalation and engage directly or indirectly in genuine dialogue and negotiation. It is the only way to reach a mutually acceptable solution to this conflict in line with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, taking into consideration all security concerns. Also, the international community should play a vital role in creating conditions that could facilitate dialogue between the parties to reach such a solution and to end this war. Madam President, escalation is the right path toward failure. We must change direction. Let's give diplomacy a real chance. Peace and security should be our only option, and I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Miroslav Janča for his briefing. I welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned about the escalating security situation and the deteriorating humanitarian situation in a conflict which has continued for close to 3 years now. In recent months, the conflict has escalated dramatically, and the battlefield has expanded with intensified offensive operation by both parties. A week ago in this chamber, Sierra Leone took note of several news reports that restrictions on the use of long-range missiles to strike targets inside the Russian Federation have been lifted, following recent intelligence and open-source reports that the DPRK troops are now engaged in combat in the Kursk region. We stated that if these reports were confirmed, that will mark a dangerous escalation of the conflict. Today, we take note of Ukraine's letter dated 25th November 2024, stating that the Russian Federation has used a new intermediate-range missile on 21st November to attack the city of Dnipro, and also continues to carry out massive missiles and drone strikes against residential areas and critical civilian infrastructure. These actions, if confirmed, represents a dangerous escalation in the conflict. We further take note of reports from Ukraine of multiple attacks that continue to target and damage electricity and gas facilities, despite the looming winter, and also numerous civilian facilities across Ukraine. We have reiterated many times in this Council in the course of this year that the deliberate targeting of residential or civilian areas, civilian infrastructure, and essential services such as hospitals, schools, water and energy facilities are unacceptable and prohibited under international law. It poses a significant threat to the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable and protected populations, violating the basic tenets of humanity and the principles of international humanitarian law. Sierra Leone also deems as unacceptable attacks on civilians, vital civilian infrastructure, and protected objects. We call on all involved parties to take all necessary measures to avoid further civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. Madam President, the deteriorating security situation also continues to have devastating humanitarian consequences on the civilian population. Latest updates from UN aid teams have highlighted the deepening humanitarian crisis across Ukraine, particularly in frontline areas in the northeast and south, owing to intensified attacks. OCHA has warned that civilians remaining in frontline communities in Donetsk, Kharkiv, Kherson, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhia face dire living conditions, which is expected to worsen as winter approaches. Reported attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure have drastically reduced the country's electricity capacity, leading to daily power cuts for millions of people across Ukraine. These outages, often lasting many hours, limit access to water, mobile networks and internet, and public transportation, and disrupt children's ability to learn and even attend school remotely. As Ukraine approaches its third winter since the start of the conflict in February 2022, Sierra Leone is deeply concerned that repeated attacks on energy infrastructure are expected to exacerbate the challenges civilians will face, with likely disruption to essential services such as water, gas, and heating. We note that to address the winter-specific needs, the humanitarian community launched the 2024-2025 Winter Response Plan, appealing for $492.1 million to support 1.8 million people with critical winter-related humanitarian assistance, as outlined in the 2024 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. This plan intends to support timely preparedness and response. Sierra Leone calls on the international community to support this plan. The drastic escalation, alarming civilian casualties, and the devastating humanitarian consequences of the conflict on civilians, including the elderly, women, and children in Ukraine, underscores the need for this violence to end. All parties to the conflict must prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from further escalation and pursuit of the option of winning the war on the battlefield at all costs. Dialogue and diplomacy should be the primary tools employed to pave the way for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Let me close, Madam President, by urging all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, to ensure essential services for the well-being and stability of civilians. Let me also repeat what we stated last week in this chamber. Peace is achieved not among friends, but between conflicting parties. In this regard, genuine peace requires overcoming hostility, bridging divides, and fostering dialogue where mistrust and animosity have taken root. It involves compromise, reconciliation, and the willingness of both parties in the Ukraine conflict to prioritize coexistence and the greater good over their grievances or individual interests. Thus, peace is most meaningful and transformative when it is forged between those who were once adversaries, as in the case in the current conflict. Sierra Leone therefore reiterates its call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate and unconditional cessation of the hostilities and for constructive and inclusive diplomatic efforts to achieve a just and lasting solution to the conflict. In taking this important step, we reiterate our call for the full respect for the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, as well as the Russian Federation. The legitimate concerns of all parties are to be taken into account in order to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. The international community, including this Council, must remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting the pursuit of a just and sustainable peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, I would like to thank Mr. Yencha for his briefing. A few days ago, Russia said it had struck the Ukrainian region of Dnipro by using for the first time an intermediate-range ballistic missile, the so-called Orechnik. This caused damage in civilian areas, and Russia accompanied it with threats against states supporting Ukraine in its right to legitimate defense. In this way, Russia has chosen escalation in its war of aggression that it itself provoked against Ukraine. None of the alleged excuses by Russia to try to justify this aggression should hide this reality. Russia attacked Ukraine, violating the UN Charter. Russia is choosing to extend this war while they could end it without any kind of harm for its own security, by stopping their military operations and withdrawing troops from Ukrainian territory. As the ICJ has said since March 2022, Russia is choosing to ride roughshod over international humanitarian law to try to break the Ukrainian people's resistance. Russia has for months been carrying out systematic strikes against residential areas and Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Russia is also choosing to jeopardize the international non-proliferation architecture by acquiring drones, ammunition, ballistic missiles from Iran, and, in violation of the Security Council's resolutions, which Russia nevertheless supported, from North Korea as well. Russia now has a deployment of North Korean troops on its territory, whose involvement in the combat would be a new escalation. There is one aggressor in this conflict, Russia, who are not hesitating to violate whole swathes of international law and to escalate the situation to pursue its war of conquest. And there is one country that has been attacked, Ukraine, which has a right under the UN Charter to defend its independence and territorial integrity. France stands alongside the people of Ukraine by providing military support which allows them effectively to implement their right to self-defense. Let us remember that this right includes the possibility to strike military sites in Russia when they are used to carry out this war of aggression against Ukraine. Ukraine must be able to defend itself and, when it wishes, to begin negotiations to find a viable peace. Russia should not count on our support wavering. Leaving this war of aggression to achieve its goal would mean accepting international disorder and the law of the jungle, where force prevails over what is right. We will remain in favour of a fair, lasting peace pursuant to the resolutions of the General Assembly. Thank you.
Representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I also extend my gratitude to ASG Jenka for his briefing. Colleagues, last week we discussed the aftermath of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, which has been ongoing for 1,000 days. Regrettably, today we gather once again in this chamber to address a grave development in this unprovoked war. Last week, I highlighted that Russia is undermining the international order and the global non-proliferation regime. However, recent developments over the past week are even more alarming. On November 19th, Russia announced the revision of its nuclear doctrine. This new nuclear doctrine allows for a nuclear response to aggression from a non-nuclear weapon state if supported by a nuclear weapon state, lowering the threshold for nuclear engagement. In addition, Russia launched an intermediate-range ballistic missile, IRBM, and this attack marks the first time that such systems have been used in combat. It is worrisome that Russia is dangerously blurring the lines between conventional and nuclear warfare by taking these escalatory actions. Madam President, the war in Ukraine is becoming further complicated with the DPRK's full involvement. Initially, North Korea supported Russia's invasion of Ukraine and was one of the only 5 member states that voted against the General Assembly resolution on March 2, 2022, entitled Aggression Against Ukraine, which deplored the aggression and demanded a full withdrawal of Russian forces. Starting about August last year, the DPRK has shipped about 20,000 containers to Russia. To date, it is estimated that Pyongyang has provided approximately 9.4 million artillery shells. Furthermore, North Korea has recently transferred not only munitions, but also artillery launch systems. My government estimates that around 150 units of 170 millimeter howitzers and 240 millimeter multiple rocket launchers have been delivered to Russia. About 11,000 North Korean soldiers have been dispatched to Russia, and some of them are now actively engaged in combat operations in the Kursk Oblast. While my government is investigating specific intelligence related to North Korean casualties, the estimated casualty toll remains unverified. The rapid pace of these developments makes it challenging for us to even keep up with unfolding events these days. Nevertheless, one thing is clear. All of these activities are blatant violations of multiple Security Council resolutions. Madam President, North Korea's increasing involvement in Russia's war against Ukraine carries serious implications. First, with North Korean troops and weapons on the battlefield, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is being internationalized and evolving into a broader confrontation. Russia can now rely on additional military resources and manpower from the DPRK to bolster its operational capabilities and sustain its military efforts. In fact, we are even facing the potential for an additional deployment of North Korean troops, as more personnel may be needed to supplement and maintain existing troop levels. Second, North Korea's full participation in the war provides Pyongyang with greater access to Russian resources and military technology. In return for sending its troops, my government assesses that the DPRK has received from Russia not only economic benefits, but also anti-aircraft missiles and equipment to reinforce its weak air defense systems. The DPRK may acquire advanced military technology, material, and equipment to advance its illegal nuclear program. With Russia's direct backing, an emboldened North Korea will likely intensify pursuit of its illegal nuclear ambitions and provocative actions, thus further destabilizing the Korean Peninsula and beyond. Third, we are currently witnessing an ominous collusion. A permanent member of the UN Security Council, with its top-tier military technology and lowered nuclear threshold, is collaborating with an impoverished and isolated regime, well known for brutally oppressing its own people. The leader of the regime is sending soldiers into distant battlefields to be used for Russia's reckless tactics, while siphoning off their salaries from Russia into the regime and funding illegal WMD development. Such a collusion, if unchecked, could profoundly shake the foundation of the international order based on the UN Charter. The international community should stand united in condemning such collusion and calling for an immediate halt to the illegal cooperation. Madam President, to conclude, the Republic of Korea once again urges Russia and North Korea to cease their military cooperation and immediately withdraw their troops. We also take this opportunity to reaffirm our steadfast position to support Ukraine's defending its people and territory in accordance with the UN Charter and international law. For our part, we will respond resolutely to any threat to our national security in cooperation with the international community, and will take corresponding measures depending on ensuing developments related to Russia-DPRK military cooperation. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank Mr. Yencha for his detailed briefing. More than 1,000 days after the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, we are facing a scenario that has taken on a new tragic dimension. The constant escalation of violence and the use of increasingly devastating weapons is threatening to take us to a point of no return, bringing about a climate of uncertainty and fear that can be felt across the globe. Just 9 days ago, USG DiCarlo reminded this council about the devastating consequences of the war. More than 12,000 civilians have lost their lives, including more than 600 children. Entire cities have been reduced to rubble. Civilian infrastructure, including more than 1,300 schools and 580 medical facilities, have been systematically destroyed. Ukraine has become one of the most heavily mined countries in the world, with almost 25% of its territory contaminated by mines. The threat of a devastating winter, exacerbated by the destruction of critical infrastructure and the continued attacks on Ukraine's energy network, is putting at risk millions of people who depend on humanitarian aid to survive. In addition, the increasing danger of a nuclear incident in areas such as Zaporizhzhia underscores how serious the situation is. Madam President, colleagues, for as long as the war continues, humanitarian needs will persist. The winter brings with it new challenges. The international community must redouble its efforts to guarantee a sustained and coordinated humanitarian response, prioritizing those who are in communities on the front lines and in neighboring areas. This includes strengthening the provision of essential services such as mental health, as well as legal and psychosocial support for victims, particularly children and women who have suffered irreparable trauma. Until peace is achieved, the parties must strictly fulfill the norms of international law, including international humanitarian law. This includes an obligation to protect civilians and to rigorously abide by the fundamental principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Madam President, we cannot underestimate the risks of a greater escalation of the conflict and its implications for international security. The parties must act responsibly and with restraint, avoiding any action that would bring us to the brink of a nuclear of a broader confrontation. That is why the mobilization of thousands of soldiers from the DPRK to the conflict zone is particularly concerning, as well as their potential participation in the hostilities. Equally, the use of weapons that could exacerbate the situation further must be avoided. The time has come to stop the violence and destruction. Russian and Ukrainian citizens deserve to live in peace. The world cannot allow a larger-scale conflict. The international community must redouble efforts to bring about the propitious conditions for a return to dialogue and for an immediate ceasefire. As I said a week ago, since February 2022, this Council has held about 100 formal open meetings which have allowed us to express our positions. The time has come for us to look at all tools and available modalities to avoid this forum becoming a sounding board where words are just repeated without there being specific actions taken to bring about peace. During this debate, a common thread has emerged from the statements. First, the need to abide by the principles enshrined in international law and the United Nations Charter. And secondly, the imperative need to bring about a de-escalation given the risks posed by this conflict. Ecuador fully agrees with these calls, and we reiterate our support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine, and we stand ready to support any initiative that would move us closer towards a negotiated solution leading towards fair and sustainable peace based on international law and the principles of the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. I'd like to start by thanking ASD Yencha for his briefing today. Colleagues, last week we marked 1,000 days since Russia launched its illegal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We recalled the devastating impact the war has had upon the Ukrainian people and the world, and reiterated our steadfast commitment to ensuring Ukraine gets the support it needs to defend itself and to achieve a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. President Putin has demonstrated time and again that he has no interest in such a peace. In recent weeks and months, Russia has intensified its attacks on Ukraine. First, it has stepped up the use of indiscriminate glide bombs against Ukrainian cities. Last week, the UN announced that the number of civilians killed since February 2022 had reached over 10,000, with over 18,500 injured. Second, Russia has intensified its deliberate targeting of civilian energy infrastructure. This is a war crime, and it puts the lives of millions of Ukrainians at serious risk during cold winter months. Third, Russia has used experimental weapons. Last week, it fired an intermediate-range ballistic missile on Dnipro. Ukraine is not a testing ground for new weapons. I could go on. But this pattern of reckless activity by Russia serves only to prolong the war and the suffering of Ukrainian people, whilst posing serious risks to international peace and security. There is only one aggressor here, and only one country in breach of the Charter. To seek de-escalation we must focus on deterring Russia from that aggression. No one wants peace more than Ukraine. But Ukraine needs to be able to defend its civilians from these brutal attacks. Ukraine has a right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, and we will support them in their efforts to achieve a sustainable peace. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Assistant Secretary General Yencha, I also recognize here the residual presence of Putin's envoys in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. I would like to thank the Ukraine presidency for convening this meeting that Ukraine requested in response to Russia's recent escalatory actions. These include the first use of an intermediate-range ballistic missile to strike the Ukrainian city of Dnipro and the use of DPRK troops in its war against Ukraine. The ongoing deployment of DPRK troops to support Russia remains one of the clearest indicators of Moscow's unwillingness to de-escalate, alongside the weapons supplies Russia has been receiving from Pyongyang for over a year. Since the Council's most recent discussion, the situation on the ground has escalated, and first clashes of the Ukrainian forces against DPRK servicemen already took place. As we informed earlier, the troops are fighting under assumed identities of Russia's Far East nationalities using forged documents. Primarily, they operate as combined arms units trained for action in the European theater of military operations. The DPRK is now entering the war in a fully fledged manner. According to available information, its current military contingent of 11,000 troops could quickly be increased to 100,000. The question of whether the Pyongyang regime truly requires such a substantial number of combat-trained servicemen solely to assist its Russian allies is rhetorical at best. The answer to this question is self-evident, and while it may be uncomfortable, acknowledging this reality is essential. Otherwise, an appropriate and adequate response would be unlikely. According to the publicly available information, the DPRK had sent more than 20,000 containers of artillery, missiles, and other conventional arms to Russia since August 2023 to replenish its dwindling weapons stockpiles. As reported by Ukraine's military defense intelligence, Pyongyang has supplied Moscow with 100 Kan-23 and Kan-24 short-range ballistic missiles. The first use of these weapons by Russia against Ukraine, including against residential areas and civilian infrastructure, was recorded at the end of 2023. In 2024, Ukraine has documented approximately 60 launches of such missiles, according for 1/3 of all ballistic missile attacks carried out by Russia this year. Furthermore, recent reports from the expert community point to satellite images that reveal the DPRK is expanding a manufacturing complex in the city of Khamkhun. This industrial facility assembles Kan-23 short-range ballistic missiles, which Russia has used against Ukraine, including for targeting residential areas and civilian infrastructure. The satellite images reportedly taken in early October show the construction of what appears to be an additional assembly building, as well as a new housing facility likely intended for workers. Additionally, there have been recent reports that Russia received 170mm self-propelled howitzers and 240mm multiple rocket launch systems from the DPRK. Let me recall that the transfer of ballistic missiles, along with any other arms and related material from the DPRK to Russia, flagrantly violates multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions. The training by the Russian Federation of DPRK regular units, including those recently deployed in the Kursk region, constitutes a violation of Security Council Resolutions 1718, 1874, and 2270. In turn, DPRK soldiers providing or receiving any training or other assistance related to use of arms is also a violation of the mentioned resolutions. We reiterate that Pyongyang's support comes at a price, and this is an access to Russian technology in missile, nuclear, and other military programs. It is crucial to understand that this price is paid not so much by Russia, but by the world. Failure to act decisively will be far more costly in the long run than taking strong and timely measures today. We call on all responsible nations to take immediate actions to resolutely counterattack the Russian and North Korean regimes, from increasing sanctions pressure on Moscow and Pyongyang to maximizing Ukraine's capabilities within the framework of the victory plan presented by President Zelensky. At the same time, the Security Council and its 1718 Sanctions Committee should continue addressing the issue of non-compliance of the DPRK and the Russian Federation with relevant UN Security Council resolutions. In this regard, Ukraine also supports the monitoring and reporting on violations and evasions of the sanction measures by both regimes within other multilateral mechanisms, in particular multilateral sanctions monitoring team established on October 16, 2024. Madam President, another escalatory move by Putin aimed at testing the world's resilience to Russia's nuclear blackmail occurred on November 21. On that day, the Ukrainian city of Dnipro suffered an attack by an intermediate-range ballistic missile capable of delivering weapons of mass destruction. According to an initial examination of remnants, it was the first time that such a missile has been identified on the territory of Ukraine. The missile was equipped with 6 warheads, each containing 6 sub-munitions. It moved along a ballistic trajectory which was only affected by aerodynamic resistance. Moscow's narratives following the strike, including comments by war criminal Putin, once again underscored Russia's intentions to persuade the global audience of its complete inadequacy, this time by showing readiness to kill Ukrainians not only with conventional, but also nuclear means. Ukraine calls on UN member states, in particular nuclear weapon states, to condemn Russia's irresponsible nuclear saber-rattling. In responding to this escalatory step, it is also important to remember that Putin's future actions will directly depend on the strength and resolve of our reaction. In effect, this modus operandi has always been simple and straightforward. If his blackmail succeeds and his opponent shows weakness or willingness to appease, a new and more severe escalation of violence and violations will inevitably follow. On the contrary, if adequate measures to deter Russia and reduce its aggressive potential are taken, Putin will stop. Therefore, the response to the Kremlin's current nuclear blackmail and threats must include tougher sanctions and increased military assistance to the party defending itself, its people, and the principles of the UN Charter. In this context, we do not accept concerns about strengthening Ukraine's capacities to strike military targets on Russian territory as alleged escalation. Such labeling either demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of conflict's nature and current developments on the ground, or serves as manipulation in the aggressor's interests. It was from Russian territory that the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. It is on Russian territory that new military units were being formed to occupy and destroy Ukrainian cities and kill Ukrainian people. It is on Russian territory that the production of deadly weapons is accelerating, weapons that will be used not only against Ukraine, despite the illusions of those hoping to buy a few years of peace at the expense of Ukraine's existence. Finally, it is from Russian territory that missiles, drones, and guided aerial bombs are launched daily, killing Ukrainians and destroying our critical infrastructure. This includes drones from Iran and missiles from the DPRK, enabling these rogue states to test their weaponry. More than 11,500 missiles were launched against Ukraine since February 2022. More than 33,000 guided aerial bombs were deployed. Over the past 4 days alone, 495 UAVs were launched by Russia, along with Iskander ballistic missiles and Kh-59-69 guided air-to-surface missiles. Among the targets that Russian forces attempt to strike are the transmission substations of our nuclear power plants. Following the Russian attack on November 17, the IAEA Director General stated that several electrical substations on which the NPPs depend had suffered further damage. In addition, the main power lines from 4 of the substations were disconnected. This poses a real and immediate threat to nuclear safety and security, not only for Ukraine, but for the entire continent. Strikes on Russian territory help reducing such war-related threats. Unlike Russia, Ukraine does not target residential areas, hospitals, or civilian infrastructure. Our goal is not to intimidate the Russian civilian population, but to weaken the ability of the Kremlin regime to threaten Ukraine and the world. Russian military command posts, airfields, artillery arsenals, missile deployment sites were among the most recent targets hit by the Ukrainian forces. Every target struck means a Ukrainian life saved, somebody's home or power station preserved. Ukraine will continue to exercise its inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. This right, I remind you, does not impose geographical limitations on defending against an armed attack. At the same time, Article 51 does not allow an aggressor to hide its violations under the guise of the right to self-defense, as self-defense applies in cases where an armed attack occurs or is imminent. In February 2022, as we all remember, the qualification of imminent was only applied to Russia's plans to invade Ukraine. The plans that Russia denied in this very chamber a week before the invasion at the level of its deputy foreign minister. Russia must understand that its every attempt to expand the war will have consequences. This serves to sober the aggressor state, disrupts its plans, and enforce it toward peace. A comprehensive, just, and lasting peace based on the UN Charter, not on deceitful appeasement reminiscent of Munich 1938. The former could be achieved through 2 things: helping Ukraine and increasing pressure on Russia, and if the latter prevails, the price for all of us would be far too high. One speaker today has said that he cannot help but wonder, can those caught in the war be reunited with their families? Is there anyone they can be thankful for? Can they have a happy and peaceful tomorrow? End of quote. The answer is yes. There are 141 countries in the General Assembly they can be thankful for. The countries who voted for the condemnation of the Russian aggression in March 2022. The answer is yes. There are 141 countries they can be thankful for who call a spade, who voted in February 2023 for the resolution on the principles of the UN Charter underlying just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in Ukraine, including Ukraine's territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Yes, they can be thankful to dozens of countries that help Ukraine with air defense systems, with means to destroy military bases in Russia, where hundreds of missiles are launched to kill Ukrainian children, women and men. And I want to conclude with my profound gratitude to all those countries that have been supporting Ukraine through almost 3 years of this bloody war. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Madam President, I would like to thank ASG Mirosław Jęcza for his briefing. As it was mentioned just last week, we gathered in this Council to mark the milestone of the 1,000 days since Russia's unprovoked and brutal invasion of Ukraine. This sobering anniversary should have served as a wake-up call to the international community. Yet, Russia, undeterred, has chosen to escalate the conflict further, demonstrating a blatant disregard for international law and human life. Furthermore, Russia's increasingly active support from other states is transforming this war into a collective act of aggression. Madam President, Russia has intensified its aggression against Ukraine through a combination of verbal threats and military actions. The recent attacks against Dnipro on November 21st, targeting Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure with the use of the modified RS-26 Rubesh intermediate-range ballistic missiles Oreshnik, capable of carrying nuclear warheads, represents a new level of danger in the conflict with Ukraine. This move, coupled with the revision of Russia's nuclear doctrine, constitutes another instance of nuclear saber-rattling, further undermining the global security architecture. Such behavior not only threatens the stability of Ukraine and the region, but also increases the risk of wider conflict and nuclear proliferation. The Kremlin's aim is clear: to intimidate Ukraine and its supporters and sway public opinion to deter international support, but this will not happen. The international community must send a clear message to Russia: its nuclear threats will not be tolerated. Poland strongly opposes and deplores such reckless actions, calling on Russia to cease its aggression, withdraw its troops from internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, and return to the path of diplomacy. We reiterate that Ukraine's defensive operations to diminish Russia's capacity to wage its illegal war are a legitimate exercise of an inherent right to self-defense, fully in line with the international law and Article 51 of the UN Charter. In contrast, Russia, as an aggressor, continues to violate fundamental principles of international law, including the prohibition of the use of force against the territorial integrity and sovereignty of any state and international humanitarian law. Russian authorities and soldiers must be held accountable for all crimes committed in Ukraine. If they go unpunished by international justice, aggressive Moscow could inspire other actors to replace international law with the might makes right approach. This could lead to a world where coercion and intimidation replace peaceful negotiations and time-consuming reconciliation in every region. Madam President, any further peace must be grounded on the UN Charter and international law and must be negotiated and agreed upon by Ukraine. We believe that the President Zelensky's peace formula currently best embodies these principles, and I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. I want to thank you for organizing this meeting, and also special thanks to ASG Jęcza for his briefing. Colleagues, only last week we marked 1,000 days since Russia's unprovoked and unjustified full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I delivered a statement at that occasion in front of this chamber on behalf of the EU and its member states again. And today we are compelled to meet once again after Russia once again stepped up its offensive with a new wave of escalations. The past days, Russia has intensified its massive aerial assaults against Ukrainian cities, once again killing innocent civilians, including children. It has once again inflicted further damage on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, also endangering nuclear safety and security, as nuclear sites need a secure off-site power supply. It has once again expanded its use of arms, firing a new ballistic missile against Dnipro. And it has once again deepened its military cooperation with the DPRK, now deploying thousands of North Korean troops to support its war of aggression in violation of UNSC resolutions. Dear colleagues, each of these actions separately constitute once again unacceptable escalations and serious breaches of international law. Russia must be held fully accountable for its violations. The world counts on all Council members to defend international law, to seize any and all assistance to Russia's war of aggression, and to assist Ukraine in achieving a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. Might cannot make right. We can never accept attempts to change borders by force. Territorial integrity is at the core of the UN Charter, and it must be upheld. So, once again, we will continue to support Ukraine to defend the UN Charter in response to Russia's aggression, and we will do so for as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President. I had the honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We align ourselves with a statement of the European Union. Let me add a few additional elements. First of all, I would like to thank ASG Janša for his briefing. Thank you. President, criminal Russia's regime, instead of opting to de-escalate and to end this war, it calls and to call of the international community to find a peaceful end to this war, has again decided to pursue escalation in Ukraine, exemplified by Russia's launching a record amount of drone strikes into Ukraine during the past days, in which energy infrastructure, including of the nuclear power plants infrastructure, in several regions was seriously hit. Moreover, last Thursday, Kremlin fired an intermediate-range ballistic missile in the city of Dnipro, with a warning that more would follow. While Russia's nuclear saber-rattling is unfortunately nothing new, firing experimental missiles with capability of carrying nuclear warheads at another member state is an irresponsible and deeply concerning development. Let me be clear. Such desperate attempts of intimidation are not going to work. President, the deepening involvement of Iran, the DPRK, and Belarus in Russia's aggression against Ukraine must stop immediately. DPRK's continued large-scale supply of artillery shells and ballistic missiles to Russia, and the involvement of the DPRK's troops fighting on Russia's side in Ukraine are a major escalation with global consequences. President, we also urge China as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council with a particular responsibility to uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, to exercise its influence to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, providing indeed peaceful tomorrow for Ukrainians. In addition, recent reports of Russia recruiting cannon fodder from Yemen to fight in Ukraine only further displays Russia's escalatory course of action. It is highly alarming that military and mercenaries from all over the world are being recruited to fight in the heart of Europe to satisfy Russia's neocolonial and imperial ambitions. President, the developments that I and many around this table have highlighted only confirm that Russia's goals in Ukraine have not changed. They don't want peace, but to erase sovereign Ukrainian state from the map and root out the national identity of Ukrainian people. This is not going to happen. We will not allow this to happen. We will stand with the Ukrainian people and reiterate our unwavering support to Ukraine's right for self-defense and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We call upon the UN membership to support Ukraine's peace formula, which is the only viable framework to secure a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, based on principles of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. Only a week ago, here in this chamber, the draft resolution reflecting the unanimous demand of the international community for immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza was rejected by United States veto. The result was the rise of the abnormal situation of the throwing into darkness and despair the Palestinian people in their aspiration for survival and abetting Israel's nefarious atrocity of the mass killings. However, UN Security Council laid aside the most pressing security issue at the present time when we witness tragedy of merciless killings that could even make Hitler blush with shame. Overwhelmed by a high-handed practice of the one permanent member of the Security Council, it has convened a meeting that completely runs counter to the fundamental principle enshrined in the UN Charter. Now, this is truly disgrace to be condemned by the international community. I strongly denounce the United States and its following forces and are calling for this another 11 meeting, proceeding from their ulterior political motive to cover up the root cause of the outbreak and protraction of the Ukrainian crisis and deceive the international community. As has been clarified on several occasions, the Ukrainian crisis was started by the United States and Western forces that ignore a legitimate security interest and the right to territorial integrity of Russia and pursued NATO's reckless eastward expansion under the ambition to maintain their hegemonic world order. It is none other than the United States and Western forces that ruptured hard-won peace talks between Russia and Ukraine at the beginning of the event, and that caused and also the civilian casualty and prolonged the crisis by systematically supplying the various lethal weapons to Kiev authority, obsessed with the pipe dream to deal a strategic blow to Russia. Today, the Ukrainian crisis is plunged into almost grave and irreversible phase as present U.S. administration, nearing end of its term, has irresponsibly allowed the Kiev authority to strike area with Russia with the weapons supplied by it, and some Western countries followed suit. Ukraine invaded Russia's Kursk in August, the killing of numerous civilians, and recently, with public support from the United States and the West, it even went on to commit a dangerous crime of attacking Russian territory, using United States surface-to-surface missile ATACMS and UK air-to-surface cruise missile Storm Shadow. All facts give a clear answer to who is main culprit that further escalating Ukrainian war and aggravating tensions. Russia's counterstrike on November 21st is the exercise of the just and legitimate right to self-defense and served as a serious warning to the U.S. and Western countries in the war mania. The pressing issue to be addressed at the UN Security Council at the present is the act of undermining peace by the United States and its allies that are inciting confrontation and conflict among countries, while running amok the strength of aggressive alliance and arms buildup driven by their ambition for hegemony. Just as fascisms in Europe and Asia collude with each other to throw the world into turmoil in the last century, the reactionary forces in the West and the East today, allied under the buttons of the United States, are now attempting to establish rapacious and tyrannical order across the world. The United States in particular is expanding nuclear-sharing military alliance system while escalating military pressure and provocation against the DPRK through deployment of its vast array of the strategic strike munition forces of the allies in the vicinity of our state. Such being the case, the United States is still picking holes on legitimate development of the relation between independent sovereign states by mastering its satellite forces. It cannot but mockery of an insult to the UN Charter. Under the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, which fully conformed to UN Charter and international law, the DPRK and Russian Federation are developing bilateral relations in all fields, including politics, economy, military, and culture, and maintaining contact with regard to each other's security and development of the situation. The DPRK will remain faithful to its obligation under the treaty and continue to strengthen and develop relations with the Russian Federation in order to defend fundamental interests of the peoples of both countries, contribute to regional and global peace and security, and realize international justice. The righteous international community should never tolerate such acts of the United States in its followers that infringe upon the sovereignty and disturb the peace in their attempt to obstruct development of the legitimate friendly relation between sovereign states and impose tragic war and catastrophic disaster. Rather, it should run out in the struggle to safeguard justice and equity, peace and stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea for their statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I apologize for taking the floor a second time. I just wanted to make a very general point and ask a question, if I may. To be clear, the deployment of DPRK troops to help Russia carry out its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine and the Ukrainian people has fundamentally changed the nature of this war, posing not only a growing threat to Ukraine, but also an increasing threat to broader European security. The United States will continue to take, and its allies, to take all steps necessary to help Ukraine defend itself and to ensure allied security. And my last point is just a question to the representative from the DPRK regime. It's a very simple question, and I think this Council would appreciate a very succinct answer. Has DPRK deployed troops to Russia? Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. The representative of Ukraine has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Well, thank you, Madam President. I'm not going to comment the pulp fiction by North Korea edited by the Russian mission. But I forced myself to stay in this chamber out of respect to this institution and out of the need to look in the eyes of the representative of DPRK to tell him directly that he represents a criminal regime, that he represents the regime that helps another criminal regime, and that by the end of the day, sooner or later, you and your leadership will end up in the dock. And sooner or later, your people will be free, and then we'll enjoy democracy and freedom and liberty.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. We regret the fact that the representative of the US is continuing to waste the valuable time of the Security Council, but listening to his conjecture and his smearing of countries that Washington doesn't like. Now, this is just the typical Anglo-Saxon thinking along the lines of highly likely. We repeatedly provided exhaustive clarifications. Our colleagues from DPRK today clearly laid out their position. So those who have ears, may they hear. If the US and its allies choose the path of escalation, and that is our conclusion, we see that from today's statements. They didn't want to talk about the real reasons for the wave of escalation, the green light that the Western donors of the Kiev regime has given to use long-range missiles within the Russian Federation. If the US and its allies choose this escalation, well, we're ready for that. But we would urge you to look at the very basis of common sense and have a long, hard think about the fact that we need a serious dialogue about the need to eradicate the root causes of the crisis. We've always been prepared to engage in that. So, our distinguished Western colleagues, the choice is yours. The whole world is waiting. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. The representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to take a floor to reaction to the comment made by United States delegate. It is a legitimate right for DPRK to develop the relation with the Russian Federation. The treaty on comprehensive strategic partnership between DPRK and Russian Federation is fully conform to international law and the UN Charter. Therefore, the DPRK will remain faithful to its obligation under that treaty. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. Before adjourning this meeting, as this is the last scheduled meeting of the Council for November, I'd like to express the sincere appreciation on behalf of the United Kingdom to the members of the Council and to the Secretariat for the support they have provided this month. We also thank the technical support team, the conference service officers, the interpreters, the translators, the verbatim reporters and the security staff for enabling the Council to carry out its meetings. As we end our presidency, we wish the delegation of the United States good luck in the month of December. The meeting is adjourned.